There's some NBA players who almost transcend basketball, who become so iconic in our culture that they are beloved by even those who don't know much about the sport. When a rare player like this comes along, it is likely that the value of their cards will remain evergreen. That is, they are the kind of cards that aren't likely to ever go down much over the long term. I say the long term because over short-term glances perhaps, as the basketball card market, like any other market, is volatile and ever-changing, and it can drift like the wind based on all sorts of economic factors. But for the long term, this list consists of players whose value is ever-present and likely always will be so. When looking at a list like this, it's easy to first identify Hall of Famers who meet the criteria set forth for this video. We will start by identifying them. After that, it gets a little bit more tricky. Recognizing currently playing NBA players who will eventually reach this status is not as straightforward of a task, and it does involve a certain degree of guesswork. Nonetheless, let's get into this. If you like this kind of basketball card related content, please do subscribe to the channel, and we've got a lot more coming your way in the future. First, let's look at retired players whose card values will always be very high. The pictures you will see are from the most iconic of their various rookie cards. We'll start with the two most obvious names first. Number 1, Michael Jordan, 1986 Fleer. I mean, of course, do we even really need to say much here? He's MJ, he's the GOAT. Not only that, but his early years were before basketball cards really began to take off, making his 1986 Fleer rookie card perhaps the most iconic card in the history of all sports. Number 2, Kobe Bryant. When it comes to basketball cards, there really is a big three. The three players whose cards just soar in value above all others: Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and Kobe Bryant. Not only was Kobe a talent beyond measure, but his influence in the wider culture is also one that will keep rippling forever. Now, before continuing on here, I think it's important to mention that some of the all-time greats from older eras before the MJ era have to have an asterisk next to their name, because they were from an era before basketball cards were really much of a thing. As such, for the most part, these are not players you're going to be able to go out and find their cards at your local sports card shop. These are more like classic cards for the niche vintage collector. They aren't necessarily that ridiculously expensive, however, at least if you don't mind a raw card that will almost certainly not be in perfect condition. The PSA 10s, even the PSA 9s and 8s, can be quite expensive, but the raw cards can really be quite cheap. But I can't have a video like this without mentioning these historic greats. So the next ones here are the highlights from early NBA history, and are on this list most especially because of their historical importance. We will start with one or two cards from each of the decades from 1940, and then get a lot more names as we enter the 1980s and onward. From the 1940s, George McMahon. George McMahon is on this list because he was the most dominant professional basketball player when the league began. As such, this is a card that will always hold an important spot in NBA and in basketball card history. From the 1950s, Bill Russell, an 11-time NBA champion, one of the greatest of all time. If you were only to get one card from the 1950s, this 1957-58 Topps would be the card to get. And from the 1960s, we actually have two names to mention. The first is Wilt Chamberlain. So if you would pick up McMahon to represent the 40s and Russell to represent the 50s, then you would definitely want to pick up this 1961-62 Fleer of Wilt Chamberlain to represent the 1960s. And if you didn't get that one, Oscar Robertson was another of the big names of the 60s. And though his cards are not necessarily as expensive as you think they should be, he is definitely one of the greatest of all time. And the value of his cards will certainly never diminish, like this 1961-62 Fleer. Now on to the 1970s, Lou Alcindor. So I guess this is kind of officially 1960s as well, but let's consider it to be the 1970s since it was just a couple of months in the 1960s before the 1970s started. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar doesn't become too much more iconic than this guy. If Wilt Chamberlain was the face of the 60s, Kareem was the face of the 70s. But you cannot skip past the 1970s and forget about Dr. J, Julius Erving, or his 1972-73 Topps rookie card. His rookie can be tracked down for relatively inexpensively, surprisingly, although the PSA 10s and 9s can be quite expensive. Now, as we get into the 1980s, things start to change a bit. The early part of the 1980s still had pretty few basketball cards, but when you can find an old and early card in good condition from these players, you're in a good position. Magic Johnson, 1980 Topps, or Larry Bird. Magic and Larry define the early 1980s in NBA history, and they will forever be relevant to the NBA conversation. I was really happy when I recently picked up a 1980 Magic Johnson rookie card. It is 1/3 of a card actually, as it used to be connected to two other players, but at some point in the past 40 years, it was separated from the other two players. Now into the mid to late 1980s, starting with the iconic 1986 Fleer set where Jordan's rookie can be found, cards started to become more of a thing. So for the rest of the players, their cards are much more plentiful. In fact, into the late 1980s through the late 1990s, cards were just being printed so copiously that cards from players you think would be valuable just really aren't. but that is just because so many of them exist. Value in basketball cards is often directly related to scarcity, and some of these players are far from scarcely found in the basketball card realm. Other than Jordan, Magic, and Bird, among the rest of the rookies from the 1980s decade, 2 stand out as having cards with value that is very high, and they're both from Jordan's draft class as well, Hakeem Olajuwon and Charles Barkley. Besides those already mentioned, there are a number of others who are also iconic players from their era that influenced their sport in major ways. Their cards aren't necessarily always the most expensive, since they came up right here during the junk wax era of basketball card collecting, but they're still valuable in their own right and likely will be evergreen forever. Those players include David Robinson, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Patrick Ewing, Reggie Miller, Clyde Drexler, Dominique Wilkins. Oh, and I almost forgot, Isaiah Thomas. Now again, some of these players' cards aren't necessarily worth that much, like Isaiah Thomas, but nonetheless, whatever value they do hold will likely never decrease. Now, let's move up to the players whose rookie years were in the 1990s. Now, while the 1980s, card-wise, is definitely highlighted by MJ's rookie, the 90s is highlighted by Kobe's rookie. But besides the Black Mamba, the best evergreen cards from players who will forever be relevant in the basketball conversation are Shaquille O'Neal and Tim Duncan, followed by a relatively long list, some of whom actually have very inexpensive rookie cards, but will still likely remain relevant to the basketball conversation for long into the future. Chris Webber, Allen Iverson, Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen, Steve Nash. As we get up into the decade of the early 2000s, we start to get a mix of players who are retired and who are still in the league today. However, because all of these players have been in the league for at least a decade, it's pretty easy to tell who will be among a coveted legacy list like this into the future. Of course, the highlight of the 2000s decade is without a doubt LeBron James and his 2003-2004 Topps rookie card. From MJ in the 80s, Kobe in the 90s, and LeBron in the zeros, these are the big 3 when it comes to sports cards. LeBron's cards will no doubt be evergreen for the long term, just like MJ and Kobe. So really for long-term investment, there really is no better choice than one of those 3. Besides LeBron, the other evergreen players with their rookie years between 2000 and 2009 include Kevin Durant, Steph Curry. Now once again, each decade seems to have one big highlight followed by 2 other players whose cards stand out a bit above the crowd of superstars. Durant and Curry are that for the zeros. The 2000s, do I say? The knots? I don't know. One thing to keep in mind though with the rookies between 2000 and 2009 is that since these players are still playing, their cards might be having more volume of transactions these days compared to retired players, meaning their prices might fluctuate a bit more. Once they do retire, however, their cards will still remain evergreen, and I think they won't continue anywhere near the volume of trading they're having now, which could affect their value in some ways after retirement. Nonetheless, for the long term, their iconic and unique cards should be valuable forever. Besides the 2 of them, though, some other likely evergreens include James Harden, Dwayne Wade, Russell Westbrook, Chris Paul. Originally, when I started making this video, I was going to talk about those rookies within the past decade who may become part of this coveted evergreen position, but I think this deserves a video of its own, especially since this one here is kind of getting long. So please subscribe to the channel and check out our next video in which we will analyze the long-term investment potential of rookies who have been in the league starting within this past decade.